everyone, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here. Today I want to start a series on focal points, and focal points gives us a target with which to attack when we're not really sure what we're supposed to be doing, especially against a castled king. Now there can be focal points when the king is still in the center of the board. There can be focal points when the king is castled queenside, but let's begin with the most common, which is on the king side. And a focal point could simply be a square in front of the king. For instance, h7 is probably the most commonly attacked focal point in chess. G7 is probably the most dangerous focal point, although not as common. F7 is also a great square to attack. And then if this pawn had moved forward in a fianchettoed position, G6 is a common focal point also. So I want to begin the series talking about the G7 square just because of how dangerous it is. And if you get an opportunity to attack G7, I want you to see how powerful it is to make this your target. So let's dive into some basic ideas here. The first thing I want you to notice, and hopefully you've already seen this, that the queen is threatening checkmate, supported by the bishop. Okay, so simply if queen captures that focal point, it's game over. So we're focusing on that square. One of the neat things to note here is that where the queen is located is just one single move away from her starting position. And same with the bishop here, kind of in a fianchettoed position from its starting point. So it doesn't take long to build pressure against the G7 square, and black needs to be very concerned about this. We're also going to see here in a moment that when the tables are turned, that the G2 square is just as deadly for white. So let's go ahead and move forward here. And here we go. You notice that I just simply moved the bishop back to its starting square. And what I wanted to show you is that this focal point isn't just about winning the game. It can also be about winning a decisive advantage, like winning an exchange in material. So the idea here is that we can still attack this focal point by bringing the bishop into h6. You notice that both pieces are still targeting this square and threatening checkmate with the queen's next move. So black's only real good response here is to simply push the pawn so the queen no longer has access. But what he gives up is the exchange of the bishop for the rook. And so now black is down the exchange, white has won material. And of course in this puzzle, in this example here, this is a very decisive advantage for white. But in the middle of a normal game, this can still be winning for the side that gets that exchange. Another option when we're looking at these focal points is how the need to defend it opens up a second opportunity. So we saw in our Attacking the King series, Morphy's Mate, and this is a good example of Morphy's Mate here, where white simply threatens the focal point of G7 and black has to respond. And the only way to stop the checkmate here is to simply capture the offered queen. So the queen has sacrificed itself to rip open a hole. Well, by doing this, it leads to the end. We have check and then checkmate. So backing that up, utilizing the threat against the G7 focal point led us to the win of the game. So we can see that by attacking a focal point, and in this video we're talking about G7 or G2 when white is in danger, it can lead to a win or it can lead to an advantage. So let's look at some great examples in the middle of a game. So this one is just an example from a study book. It's not two players playing, but keep in mind we do have a focal point here. So white's move is to simply attack G7 with the bishop. And so black has several options here. The first option simply would be to take the offered sacrifice. And what this leads to is white doing a simple maneuver threatening checkmate that black is going to have to respond to. You might have also noticed that the queen could have also moved here to G3, causing a similar attack. The problem with that is that this bishop could simply block the queen's access to this line by moving here. So white instead chose to go over to C3. Black has to block. Now that this pawn is in the way of this bishop having access to blocking his attack. Now he swings back over to g3. And what we notice here is that it doesn't matter where black's king moves. The queen is coming into g7 for checkmate. So the only option that black has here is to give a runaway square for the king to escape to. So we take the offered piece. Now black can move away from the checkmate. And it simply leads into a rundown, and you can see that black's king is on the run. His safety in the castle position is busted, and there's a lot of threats here coming. So it didn't lead to an immediate win, but it did lead to a lot of opportunities. So by attacking here, that was, of course, what if the pawn captured? Well, there were other options for black. Black simply could have pushed the pawn forward. This also leads to trouble. Again, white can threaten to come in for a checkmate. So you've got a block. The knight helps out. And what's black to do here? There's just nowhere to escape the checkmate that's coming on the g7 square. Going back to the beginning of this again, we have another option, which is simply to defend the square with the bishop. And that also fails. We go ahead and take the pawn, attacking that focal point. And now what's black going to do here? The bishop is pinned. The checkmate is coming. We've gained the material back. And so you can see that there's not a lot of options here for black's king. King can't move here simply because of that knight threat coming in. And so I suppose he could move back, and look at all these available opportunities. We've got a knight that can hop into f6. We've got a rook lift that can come over, and the attack just builds and builds and builds. So attacking that focal point can be very powerful. Let's look at a few more quick examples here. This one was Spielman versus Grunfeld in 1929. We call this the explosion on g7 because we sacrifice a piece to rip open a hole in front of black's king, and in comes the threat. And there's nothing that can be done to stop this queen from coming in and claiming checkmate. Now, if you go back to the beginning here, and we notice that black had the option. Well, what if black simply stepped out of the way? Okay, queen can give check. Here comes the pawn, and again, there's nothing black can do. You can pause the video if you would like to, but the checkmate is definitely coming on g7. So we see a sacrifice on the focal point can rip things open. Well, what if we reverse things, and now we're the black pieces attacking the g2 square? It works just as well for the black player to bring in an attack. You notice this theme that the bishop from its starting position is only one move away from attacking this focal point. And that's what makes it so wonderful and so deadly. It doesn't take a lot of moves to get there. So be willing to sacrifice this bishop if it gives you opportunity. So bringing in another defender of the g2 square, we simply sacrifice. And let's look at a different move here first. What if you went ahead and captured? Well, now we're threatening checkmate. And you could give a defender, in case you don't see it, it is the queen adding a defense. But now the problem is that when the knight says check, we pick up the loose queen. So see how the threat of checkmate can lead to a material advantage. It's not always about winning the game immediately, but winning a decisive advantage. Okay, but we saw here that an alternative move was for the knight to hop into f5 and let that bishop sit there on the focal point. Pardon me. So we simply save the bishop, giving a hole. He tries to block things up, and here comes that check, and it's checkmate. So there's lots of different ways that things can happen here, and that's actually what occurred in the game, Spielman versus Grunfeld. This was the checkmate that ended the game. Field versus Tenor in 1933. We can already see the pressure building here on g2. And so we bring another piece to bring pressure. And he tries to bring in some help. And look at this mess. The queen is threatening checkmate. Okay, so what happens if you take the queen? You still get checkmated. So remember this position here with the bishop and the knight causing the checkmate, because if you can remember what that looks like, then you won't hesitate to bring your queen in and offer her up for a trade. And if you don't capture the queen, what could you do? If you capture the bishop, it's checkmate, protected by the knight. So there's just not a lot of options here. If you take the knight, still checkmate with the bishop. So you can see that this focal point is very deadly. Boleslavsky and Ufimtsev, 1944, I hope I mispronounced that correctly, also sees attacking against the g2 square. And we'll just kind of run through this. He brings his knight in, offering up his queen. And white can't take the queen here. If he makes a mistake of taking the queen, and we get their queen, well, notice these bishops. Anytime you've got bishops hitting both sides, you've got a lot of great opportunities here, and checkmate. Now, there's several variations on this one, but to save some time, I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Let's look at how you can win an endgame for material advantage. We got 2 games by Alekhine here. Alekhine with the black pieces in 1908 gets a material advantage. And we'll just let the pieces sort of move here. Traditional opening in the Ruy Lopez, going for a molar variation. I believe I said that right. You can see that he sacrificed a piece to gain a pawn fork. I do like that he's attacking several pieces against the king in the center of the board. And I've got some notes here with green arrows of the piece that really should be moved for a better game. You can see a different piece was chosen. We'll call it a mistake, but he's bringing pressure and continuing to bring pressure. And this was a huge mistake here, opening up this diagonal. So white takes advantage of that. Black can't take this rook here simply because of the discovered check that's going to come, possibly with a windmill attack. So we're just going to let these pieces maneuver. And what's weird about white is that he brings his knight in a great outpost that's really far away from the king, so it's doing absolutely nothing. And black says, go ahead, take the rook that's in the corner that's doing absolutely nothing. And now comes the attack against g2, forking the queen. After the queen moves, more pressure against g2. Sacrifices the rook to try and get some of the pressure off, getting rid of that bishop. In comes the attack. Trying to throw pieces at the problem. Throwing another piece at the problem to try and deflect the queen away so he can get his rook in to help against g2. More pressure against g2. And you can see here that at this point he just offers up a trade fest. And why? Because he ends up with a rook versus a bishop and has an extra pawn on top of it. Last example here is for the win. Alekhine now has the white pieces. He's playing against Lasker in 1934. These are 2 world-class players going against each other head-to-head in a queen's pawn opening. Queen's gambit declined. Pretty basic or commonly known opening theory here. And we see a lot of the pieces trading off in very similar fashion. And already we now have an attack against g7. We need to bring in more pieces to the fight. Simply maneuvering. And now we see it. We finally reached move 20, and the attack is starting to come against g7. So he pushes forward, trying to delay the attack, but it's still our focal point. Simply trying to maneuver the queen into a point of checkmate that can't be stopped. King moves. Simply maneuvering. If you don't know what that maneuver was, you've got both a bishop and a knight attacking this pawn, threatening the king, and trying to trade off a minor piece for this rook here. So the king has to come back to defend. Pushing more pieces to bear, lifting a rook, threatening the queen. And I like this move here. The pawn is pinned. It can't take the knight, and he's in check, so you can't take the queen. So you're going to have to move that king. And go ahead and pause the video, see if you can find the win here. The win is a queen sacrifice. Again, renewing the pressure against the focal point of g7. And in response, gaining checkmate down the h-file because g7 is covered by the knight. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning about focal points. This is our first video focusing on the g7 or g2 square, whether it's against white or black. We'll continue the series looking at the f7 or f2 squares, looking at the h7 and h2 squares, in a fianchettoed position, looking at the g6 or g3 squares, and so on. And I hope that really helps give you an idea of a target and what to attack in your next game. Remember, you are what you repeat. You might want to watch this video a few times until you kind of get the ideas in mind, and practice them over the board with a friend until you see them popping up in your next game.